Now, you're very welcome to the Science Gallery in association with ICON and today's lecture with our panelists, our eminent panelists, on living with motor neuron disease. Recent research claims that the genetic predisposition to motor neuron disease is what accounts for 52% of cases. We're going to be talking about the genetics, we're going to be talking about clinical trials, we're going to be talking about innovations, where we're going from here, and indeed living with motor neuron disease. We'll be talking about that as well. My name is Dr. Ciara Kelly. I am a GP and a broadcaster. And my panel today, who we will be discussing all of this is Professor Orla Hardiman, who is Professor of Neurology and Head of the Academic Unit of Neurology at Trinity College in Dublin and the National Clinical Lead in Neurology as well. We'll also be talking to Russell McLaughlin, who is Assistant Professor in Genome Analysis at Trinity as well. And we will be talking to him about genetic traits, about gene therapy, and all of what you can and cannot do, I suppose, to deal with your own genetic predisposition towards conditions like motor neuron disease. I'll also be talking to Roy Taylor and indeed his son Terence Taylor. And Roy is quite famous and was involved previously in the band Jump the Gun and represented Ireland in the Eurovision, and now has motor neuron disease himself, and we'll be talking about that as well. And indeed we'll be talking to Nuala Murphy, who is the President of Clinical Research with ICON. A little bit about ICON. ICON, who is in association across these Living With series lectures with the Science Gallery, is a global provider of drug development solutions and services to the pharmaceutical, biotechnology and medical devices, government and public health organizations, and they specialize in strategic development and the management and analysis of programs that support clinical development from compound selection up until clinical studies. ICON currently operates from 90 locations in 37 countries, and we are grateful to ICON for their involvement in this series on the Science Gallery. To start our Living With series on motor neuron disease, I would like to come, if that's okay, Roy, to you. You are somebody who lives with motor neuron disease, which is also sometimes called ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Tell us a little bit about when you were first diagnosed, how you felt about that, and then over time, what it has meant to you and the effects it's had on your life to have motor neuron disease.
Thank you, Ciara. Well, obviously, when you hear the news first, it was a complete shock. I went in to see Professor Hardiman, and although I knew she was a neurologist, I knew that covered a wide spectrum of possibilities. I never thought, as did Terence, for a moment, it was going to be motor neuron disease, because the only time I've ever seen it before was my brother-in-law, Tony. He passed away from it 8 years ago, and his condition was far different than mine. His speech, his mobility was very progressive, and I didn't relate to it at all. So when I heard the news, and I've said this many, many times, it was like a bomb going off in a movie. That slow motion suction back to the wall, where you are trying to comprehend what you've just heard. And I've said this, Professor Hardiman, that once the news was broken, almost anything she said after that was just like a ringing in my ears. I was still trying to absorb what I just heard. So from there, you in a state of numbness for quite a while. Terence was beside me, feeling much the same. But we decided very quickly to not just sit back, let this thing attack me and do nothing about it. We decided rather than roll up in a ball, we roll up our sleeves. Let's see what we can do to help the professional people we have in this country. And we have fantastic people, but just to do what we can to show that we're fighting back. And indeed, I have to say, to this very day, I'm now 2.5 years into my diagnosis. I probably have the onset, I'd say almost a year before that. And what's kept me going is the balance between positivity and negativity. Most of my days are positive, and that's a great drug. And I don't mean from a placebo point of view. I really live and breathe it. Every little ounce positivity I see, read, hear. It could be music. My great friends in Jump the Gun call up, we have a glass of wine, we have some food, talk about tours, gigs, funny things we've done. And I find after that, just to give you an example, when I'm going to bed, I can get up out of my motorized chair a little bit easier. I can grab the walker and walk a bit stronger because of the feeling that positivity puts in me. So I've come to the conclusion, Kieran, that when I smile, MND frowns. When I laugh, it cries. When I'm strong, it becomes weaker.
And Roy, you sound like a ball of positivity there, and that's wonderful. But you mentioned your motorized chair. What kind of impact, I mean, before this, and you would have had insight because it's unusual to have two non-related by blood people in one family with the same condition of motor neuron disease. So that's unusual, but you had insight. What kind of physical effects, I don't even mean in terms of your body, but what have you found that you've had to change about how you live your life and all the activities you might have done before since being diagnosed?
Quite a few. Mine is, I would say, a slow progression. I like to think it has plateaued here and there. It's a kind of a sneaky. I see MND. I animate MND. I see MND as a little green monster that sits in my brain on a couch eating corn chips, watching everything I do. When I go to lift, remote control, he presses the little button saying, I'm going to make that a bit hard for you today. If I go to stand, I'm going to pull these levers. You're not having it easy, Roy. You know, but I fight back. And that's what you do every single day. So yeah, things I can't do anymore. Can't play my bass, can't play my guitar. When I'm writing a song, I write it in my head. And Terence will work out the notes for me and the chords. That's how I do it. It's a very important thing in my life. But I don't let anything stop me.
I do actually want to get on to your music, but I'd like to bring, if it's okay, Terence in. Terence, sometimes it's harder to watch somebody we love go through something than to even go through it ourselves. How has it been for you as Roy's son, you know, watching this journey that he has been on with motor neuron disease? I'm sure it has been very difficult, but have there been particular moments that have stayed with you?
Yeah, I think here you just don't know how you're going to react until you're in this kind of situation. You know, you just sometimes imagine, you see in the movies, you know, you're sitting in the doctor's office and you get that terrible news, and you always think, geez, how would I, you know, it's almost like a dream or nightmare, I should say. And as my dad mentioned, I was beside him when we were in Prof's office, and she broke the news to us, and it was just, from what I remember of it, running down the corridors in Beaumont, just shaking my head, going like, this is a nightmare. This is not real, you know.
Yeah.
So that first week was torture, wasn't it? Like, it was sleepless nights, a lot of tears. But somehow, or one way or the other, you kind of you can nearly cry yourself out to say, okay, this is our situation. Nobody deserves this, but these are the cards we're dealt with. What can we do to try and get the word out and to help everybody, not just ourselves, but everybody that's affected by MND, you know? So yes, there have been, you know, some lows, but there have been a lot of positives also. Like, we've been involved in so many amazing projects that we wouldn't have been involved in if, you know, we weren't in this situation. So we've got to write music together. It's something we never did, and I'm playing music all my life with my dad, but we never actually got to even write a song, which we've been doing to raise awareness for motor neuron disease. But you know, there are challenging times. He tweeted there recently he had to give up his beloved car. That was a big part of his profession, driving all around the country and playing gigs, and there's things like that. You know, it's like you do feel an anger of why, but you have to say to yourself, no one deserves this. and we just have to deal with it as best we can. That's what we're trying to do.
And I did say, Ciara, that most of my time is in a positive mode, but you have to have negative times.
Yeah.
A bit of darkness creeps in, and I kind of let it sort of like a swelling of sadness that you have to go through, because I also believe there's positivity in crying every now and then. You drain out the engine, the dirty oil is gone, leaving you fresh for the next day.
Well, I think if you're having those emotions, it's only healthy to acknowledge them and to deal with them rather than to try and sweep them under the carpet. And sometimes relentless positivity can be a trap, and you have to deal with those. I'm glad you mentioned the prof, because I'd like to bring her in if that was okay. Professor Orla Hardiman, you have obviously been at the forefront of neurology in Ireland for as long as I can certainly remember. I'm sure you have heard many families tell stories like Roy and Terence there. Can you just, for people listening, explain, I suppose, what motor neuron disease is, and just in general the kinds of effects that people who have it might be struggling with?
Yeah. Hi Roy. Hi Terence. So motor neuron disease is neurodegeneration. It's one of the family of conditions where the brain, parts of the brain, for some reason that we don't fully understand, but people like Russell McLaughlin are helping us to understand, some of the nerves or particular groups of nerves in the brain, the spinal cord, become dysfunctional, and they become faulty, and then eventually some of those nerves die. And we know that in motor neuron disease, it's mostly the nerves that control our ability to move. So how we think about moving, how we initiate movement, that's in the brain, and then how the movement is executed, that's in the nerves coming from the spine out into the muscle. So it's a slightly unusual neurodegeneration, because most of the neurodegenerations that we think about are things like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. They're confined to the internal workings of the brain in our head. Whereas motor neuron disease, the nerves that get out into the periphery, into our muscles, they also give trouble. So we have a combination of nerves that allow us to plan thinking and think about moving rather than moving, and nerves that then actually make the muscles work, both start giving trouble. And then you can imagine that how that might manifest. So depending on where the nerves start getting sick within the brain and the spinal cord, that'll determine how motor neuron disease starts. So in Roy's case, actually, the nerves that started giving trouble were the nerves that supplied his diaphragm, his breathing muscles. And so that was usually the type of motor neuron disease where people do very badly. But because of new technologies around helping people to breathe, that we were able to institute some supportive treatment with Roy, and that's made a big difference. And you can see what a healthy, handsome fellow he is still now. He was always healthy and handsome, but he looks healthy and handsome now as well.
Here, oh, see?
And a really nice singing voice. Eat your heart out, Frank Sinatra. So sometimes people will have the trouble starts in the speech and the swallow, and that's actually commoner in women than it is in men. Motor neuron disease in general is a little bit more common in men than it is in women, but the type of motor neuron disease that affects speech and swallowing is a little bit more common in women, and actually slightly older age group. And sometimes people will develop a little bit of a slur in the voice, and they attribute it to, they go to their dentist, or they think that their dentures need to be fixed, or they have a little bit of trouble with their swallowing. Some people have trouble where the nerves control the arm, so they might start with a little bit of loss of muscle in the hand and a little bit of dexterity trouble. And sometimes people will have trouble where it starts in the leg. I don't know if people might remember the late Colin Murray, who was a well-known sportscaster, but we looked after Colin over the years as well. And Colin's problem started his legs. His legs became stiff and weak, and he was falling. And the same with the late Father Tony Coote. He ran into trouble with his legs first, and so his problem was falling to start off with. So the condition, unfortunately, then progresses relentlessly. As Roy said, you can sometimes see plateaus happening where the condition appears to slow down a little bit, and the person becomes is able to accommodate and work around the problems. But unfortunately, it is a condition that progresses over time, and you know, we won't lie, and we didn't lie to Roy in terms of the time. It does shorten people's life expectancy. It's a huge privilege from our point of view in our clinic in Beaumont to be able to look after people with motor neuron disease. You know yourself, Ciara, as a doctor, one of the things that we have in medicine is this enormous privilege where we get to know the intricacies and the intimacies of people's lives in a time of enormous crisis. And to me, it's hugely inspirational actually to work with people like Roy and Terence and to be involved in their journey, because every engagement that we have is an enriching experience for us, and every clinical engagement that we have in our clinic, and we see about 80% of everybody in the country who has motor neuron disease, is an enriching experience for us, and it's a learning experience for us, and it redoubles our desire to make this a condition, that an issue we can treat and ultimately that we can reverse. But it's people like Roy and Terence that keep us going, and the late Tony Coote and everybody else over the years, the 2,900 people that on our register that have been able to be involved in their care, the privilege of being involved in their care for the last 25 years.
I would completely agree with you, by the way, what you said about privilege. I've always thought that was the greatest privilege of being a doctor, was people allowing you into their lives, into their inner sort of sanctum of their most private and vulnerable lives. I would completely agree. I do want to come back to you about treatments and all that kind of stuff, but if it's all right, I might go to you, Russell. And Russell, you are assistant professor of genome analysis in Trinity. We sort of see that just over half of patients who have motor neuron disease have a genetic predisposition. Do we know a lot about that predisposition now? And do we know about, I suppose, why somebody who doesn't have a genetic predisposition might be unfortunate enough to get a condition like this?
Well, what it probably reflects is what is ultimately a very complex underlying biology for this disease. So this description, this very detailed description and explanation of what is going on in motor neuron disease that Professor Hardiman just gave us tells us a lot about what's going on the level of the patient and the nerves in their brain and in their spinal cord. But what's actually happening inside the cells, the actual nerve cells which are degenerating in motor neuron disease, is still a bit of a mystery. And that's one of the motivations of genetics research in motor neuron disease, to understand why this happens and how it interacts with, for example, potential environmental factors which might also alter people's risk for getting the disease. And one of the things over the years when we've been talking to patients and to the media about this disease, one of the things that we caution is that the pathway from understanding that biology up to actually understanding how we might cure the disease can be a very long and winding pathway, and it can take many decades. But what we have today in 2020, we are facing into this new era of what we call precision medicine, where we can turn that long and winding road from biology to cure into a much more straight, precise, Roman road, which is very directly informed by exactly what has happened in an individual patient. So as I say, this is what we call precision therapy, and this is likely the future of treatment in motor neuron disease, where we can take an understanding of the exact genetic alteration that has happened in a patient and directly target that to try to stop the disease from happening. And the other, so that gives us hope for the future of motor neuron disease treatment and research. But the other thing that gives us hope is just how quickly that can happen these days compared to even 10 years ago. So for example, one of the most important causes of motor neuron disease is a gene called C9orf72. And this has a defective version of it, which can, unfortunately, in some individuals lead to motor neuron disease. Now, this was only discovered in 2011. And already today, we are seeing clinical trials for a drug which directly interferes with that faulty copy of that gene to try to help patients who have motor neuron disease because of that. So in the coming decades, in the coming years and decades, what we are very likely going to see is a much more precision sort of approach to treating individual patients for their exact, the exact problems which are actually causing the disease in those individuals.
Okay, so are we looking at a situation where maybe somebody like me or somebody like Roy or any of us would have our own genetic makeup, but our genetic makeup somehow is interacting with the environment that we live in, and it is the combination of those factors that have come together in this case in an unfortunate and bad way to sort of trigger the expression of motor neuron. Is that what it is? So it's somebody else might have a similar genetic makeup, but whatever life they've lived, whatever happenstance that they experienced, it didn't trigger in them, and it did with somebody else. And are we actually getting down to that level of individual sort of precision?
Yes, that's exactly right. So in individuals who are carrying a genetic predisposition for motor neuron disease, it doesn't guarantee that they will get the disease before they die from something else, for example. So you could live to 100 years old without ever getting the disease, despite the fact that you carry what is generally understood to be a mutation in or a genetic change, which is supposed to be a thing that causes this disease. But understanding exactly what those environmental factors are, or those lifestyle factors, is actually a massive challenge, because once you start thinking about it, you realize that there can be thousands of different things that we need to be actually analyzing and testing. So this is why, for example, people like me do genetics research instead, because if we know there's a sort of half and half balance between the genetic predisposition and the environmental predisposition, your genetic material is a finite space that we can scientifically interrogate, and we can actually go and go hunting for the genetic changes which are causing this disease. Whereas environmental and lifestyle things, the sky is the limit in terms of actually understanding exactly what those are. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be researching those. I'm just saying it's a less precise task. It's harder to accomplish that. So we start with the genetics.
I'm sure it is hard. I'm sure it's incredibly difficult. Professor Orla Hardiman, that sounds wonderful. There's hope, there's gene therapies, there's an understanding of the genetic predisposition. Is that where the future of treatment is going to lie? Because anybody who's listening in today, and I know lots of people will be listening because they or someone they love has motor neuron disease, and that's why they're tuned into today's talk. Is that going to be the future? Are there other drugs? Are there other, I suppose, areas of research that are ongoing as well? Where do you see, I suppose, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, the treatment of this condition going?
I think we need to be a little bit careful. I think the idea that 52% of people have a genetic cause, that's not quite right. The 52% comes from the gene. What percentage of the disease has a likely genetic predisposition? So 52% is accounted by genetics. So it doesn't mean that 52% of people have a genetic cause. It means that our genetic makeup contributes by 52% to the risk of developing the disease. So that's really important. The second thing is that we know that there are some genes, there's probably about 30, but in Ireland there's only really one that we know about that's really important as a causative gene, where if you have the gene, there's a fair to middling or highish likelihood that you might get the disease. And that's the C9orf72 gene that Russell mentioned. And that accounts for about 10% of people in Ireland with motor neuron disease. So C9orf treatments, which Russell mentioned, wouldn't be suitable for anybody who doesn't have that C9orf variant. That's really important to make clear that you have to have the gene variant in order for that treatment to work. And that only accounts for about 10%. So we have on our database, we've been running a register for motor neuron disease since 1995. And there's 135 people on that register who we know had that, of about 1,500 or about 1,400 that we've tested, that we know carried that gene over many years. So that's really important. There are some other genes as well that are important to motor neuron disease. If people Google, they'll come across a gene called SOD1. And SOD1 was the first gene to be identified as an important gene in motor neuron disease. And that breakthrough was in 1991. So you can see how long it took to really integrate the understanding of that gene into what we might do next. So that gene was very important for a number of reasons. One, because it was the first gene to be identified as a familial form of motor neuron disease. Secondly, it was a gene that then was possible to insert into animals to give the animals motor neuron disease. So this is in the 90s when we were able to start doing transgenic animal research that allowed us to understand the disease a little bit more. And that's a bit of a double-edged sword that I'll get back to in a second. And then SOD1 became a target for gene therapy as well. And it was always said that SOD1 accounted for a high proportion of familial motor neuron disease, but actually it probably isn't nearly as important as C9orf. And as it happens, we don't have anybody in Ireland that carries that gene, SOD1. So it's really important that we recognise that. But Russell is right that understanding the genetic basis to the disease not only allows us to target big genes like C9orf72, that's really important. And we might also mention actually that the discovery of that gene, part of that discovery was made by an Irishman whom we trained. He was one of Russell's predecessors who worked with our group, a guy called Brian Traynor, who's now in the NIH in Boston or in the US. So there's a bit of an Irish story to that as well. But there are the identifying genetic factors might also allow us to identify new pathways that we might be able to interrupt when they go wrong and lead to the disease. And so another way that we can look at treatments, in addition to gene therapies and using gene transcripts or bits of genes to turn off the abnormal gene, is to identify pathways that then we can use drugs, other drugs that are not genetic, to maybe slow down the course of the disease or prevent the abnormal interaction between what's happening within the cell and the death of the cell or the progression of the disease. So there are quite a lot of new drugs that are being developed in that sort of framework, identifying what we think might be going wrong in the cell or even in the groups of cells as they talk to each other, and then putting in drugs that we think might be able to reverse the abnormal function of those cells or those groups of cells. One of the retardants in a way, in the way we've developed drugs, and this is really important as well, because it's something that we have to explain a lot over the years to people with motor neuron disease and other types of disease, is that it's really easy, well, to cure the disease in mice, okay? So one of the problems that we have is that we get these reports of breakthroughs. We get maybe unscrupulous colleagues in other countries who are looking for grant funding, and they'll put out a report saying, we've discovered the cure for motor neuron disease, and then you go in and it's in the mouse. And it's in that mouse with the SOD1 gene, which we know now probably isn't the best model of all of human motor neuron disease. So we need to be very careful about that. And some of the drug development that we undertook in maybe the 90s and the 2000s was overly driven by what we thought would work in mice and translating it to humans. We're much better at that now than we were. And the companies that are involved in developing new drugs have become interested in motor neuron disease again. So there's a fallow period in the late 90s and 2000s where companies just weren't really interested. Neuroscience, and I think Nuala will agree with this, neuroscience was seen as a bit of a graveyard for new drug development. And the idea that companies would invest in new therapies for the neurological disorders, and particularly things like motor neuron disease, which is rare, it was just probably not very good value for money. In the last 5 years, there's been a massive shift within the industry, and there are many clinical trials underway of compounds that really have a very strong biological plausibility for possible efficacy, possible benefit. I work closely with ICON. In fact, ICON has been very generous in supporting the work we're doing. They've contributed a significant amount of money to the development of a large platform we're trying to develop so we can collect information about patients across Europe. But we work with companies like ICON who are helping to deliver drugs and trials. And there are 40 or 50 drugs in early phase development now for motor neuron disease, 40 or 50. We have at least 5 clinical trials starting up in the next 6 months in Ireland. So we're one of the centres for early clinical trial development in Ireland. And that's only the beginning of it. That there are many drugs coming up behind these new drugs that we're starting out in the next few months. So the future is really bright and the future is really optimistic. And I think we're really getting there. We're really making a difference. We're really getting to a place where I'm sure that the next set of trials that we're doing are going to, I don't think we'll be able to cure disease, but I'm confident that we'll find drugs that will at least slow the progression and maybe getting to a point where people can live with the disease. And I bet you if you ask Roy, and I will ask him, if we could find a disease that will keep you where you're at now, that'd be okay, wouldn't it? That'd be okay. It wouldn't be great, but it'd be okay.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Your goals change as the disease progresses. You know, when I got it first, I would have said to myself, oh, if a drug came along that might cure me, but it's 10% of doing away with me, I wouldn't have taken it. Now, I'd reverse that. You know what I mean?
I think that's the way. It's small steps, but
Yeah.
I'm very confident. And the other reason I'm confident actually is because we're motor neurone disease is a rare disease, and no one country or one centre is going to be able to find all the answers. And Russell will agree with me here as well, and so will Nuala. We need groups of people around different parts of the world, and in our case in Europe, to come together and work together in a trusting and collaborative way. And we've learned that. So we over a few years ago set up a group called Project Mine, and Russell's leading out on that in Ireland now, which is a genetics project, and it's everybody in Europe is participating in that. So we all ask people like Roy to give us a sample of their DNA, and it goes into a big DNA bank, and then we interrogate that, and there's plans for 20,000 DNA samples that we can do the whole sequence of the genome, so people like Russell can start looking at the things within the genetic structure that make people at risk, and then we can start doing those important gene-environment interactions. So Project Mine has been running for about 5 or 6 years, really successfully, and we're a key part of Project Mine actually. And more recently, we set up a group that is sort of modeled on the idea of Project Mine, but it's called TriCals, and it's the treatment initiative to cure ALS. That's the reason the word cure there. And that's the centres in Europe that engage in clinical trials and clinical research. And we've come together as a group, and we're actually incorporated as a small and medium enterprise now as well. And our objective is to fix all the problems that we encountered in the beginning of this decade. So we recognize all the mistakes that we made, and we design trials in a way that's much better and more efficient and more and quicker for people, and with better outcomes that are more meaningful to people. In order to do that, we have to build this big platform so we can collect all the information about people across Europe, and ICON has been helping us to do that by supporting some of the funding for that. So it's a really exciting initiative. TriCals is where we're going to be in the future, and our clinical trials in Europe will be run through TriCals, and some of them will be industry-sponsored trials, such as Nuala's company will be bringing to us, and some of them will be drugs that the companies aren't interested in, that we want to test because we think there's biological plausibility to the drug, but nobody wants to pay for it, maybe because it's already out there. So we'll be running our own trials as well, that will be maybe crowdfunding, or we'll be writing grants in our own countries to fund these studies. So there's a lot of things happening, and it's all about people working together across Europe as a cohesive, collaborative group. And we include the UK in that as well, even though they're leaving Europe, they're still part of our collaboration, part of very important scientists in Europe as well.
Let me bring, on that note, thank you, Orla. Let me bring Dr. Nuala Murphy. And Nuala, you are president of ICON Clinical Research Services. Orla has made me feel, listening to her, very optimistic that obviously a rare condition is very hard for us to do adequate research on a local basis. So when we reach out and form international partnerships and engage in these large multi-center international clinical trials, that's where the hope lies, that all that pooled understanding is what's going to make the difference. What's your perspective, Nuala, on the clinical trials and where we're going? And I suppose there must be other conditions like motor neuron that research and large scale global, even more than European, global clinical trials are what's going to make an enormous difference to patients who are suffering with these types of conditions.
Yeah, thank you, Ciara. And I think Orla raises an awful lot of good points in terms of collaboration across the globe. And I think what that certainly brings is better decision making, broader data sets that really allow us to design better protocols. And that's really at the kind of front and forefront as to what we want to do as an organization. For us, we owe it to the motor neurone disease community to really do our best to bring trials to closure faster. So I'd say, if that's really, our raison d'etre, it's really about, A, ensuring protocols are feasible, B, that they get through ethics committees rapidly, C, that, they meet regulatory expectations. But really, it's about designing trials for patients, and it's really about making it easy for the Orla Hardimans of the world to do a trial, i.e. take all the burden, the administration away from the science. you know, when you think about the patient, it's, you know, how do you make it easy for a patient to be in a trial? You know, that's really what we're trying to focus on. You know, the traditional trial, the patient went to the hospital setting, you know, met their consultant, you know, on a monthly basis over 2 years. And whilst, you know, it's clearly important to have that interaction with your consultant, you know, it's also important that you can make it easy for the trial to come to the patient. And our focus is, and I've seen, you know, there's some trials that, you know, are being designed in ALS at the moment where there's a big shift from going to the hospital setting. We're incorporating telemedicine, we're incorporating home health visits. And that's absolutely fabulous. It's so much easier if the nurse comes to your home and, you know, brings the compound with you. You know, we've seen such evolution where so much can be done at home, whether it's vital signs, quality of life assessments. We've also seen huge advances in, you know, devices. And whilst it may be controversial, but, you know, spirometry assessments can now be done at home. And so, you know, there's huge opportunity to make it easy for the investigator, make it easy for the patient to be part of a trial. And in doing so, you ultimately reduce the overall cycle times. So
I just want to ask you though, because I mean, it sounds fantastic, but part of my head is thinking huge international studies delivering maybe treatments, but also clinical research into people's homes. It sounds wonderful. Financially, I can't imagine that it's cheap to do any of these things. And from a financial point of view, in terms of funding clinical trials on this grand scale, and in terms of them being financially viable, in terms of at the end of it producing maybe a drug that would be a breakthrough and then recouping that, how financially viable is it to do these enormous clinical trials? Because they must be astronomical in terms of their expense.
I mean, if there's one thing the whole industry agrees on, it's, you know, the whole drug development process is lengthy. The whole drug development process is costly. So, you know, if that's one thing I think the industry agrees on, it, you know, it's what everyone wants to achieve. If you can do the trials faster, if you can reduce the overall cycle times, you actually reduce the overall cost of development. And, you know, whilst everyone's talking, you know, about the pandemic, you know, I think we've also learned that it's possible to do trials in a very remote fashion. So at the beginning of the year, it wasn't possible to go to hospitals around the entire globe, starting in the east and progressing towards the west. So we did have to shift to ensuring patient safety from remotely, ensuring that we could bring, you know, trials to patients directly. And in doing that, you actually reduce the burden and you reduce the cost, in that you're not spending time traveling, you're not spending time going from A to B to actually do certain tasks that can be considered, you know, often mundane, but that can actually be done remotely. So if we look at even, you know, the kind of work we're doing today in vaccines, a lot of it is actually done remotely. In that you can, as long as you can access data remotely, you can monitor remotely, which is what you ultimately need to do in a clinical trial to ensure that the patients are being followed, the patients are being safe. But you're right, it's not easy, Ciara. I'm not saying you can just shift to telemedicine and it's easy. Far from it. The biggest, you know, area you need to conquer is how do you bring all that data together? How do you integrate all that data into one platform? And that's something we continue to work on, but that's probably the biggest challenge. The thinking's there, where we're certainly advancing towards, you know, the remote capabilities, or what people are calling decentralized trials. But really understanding how the data fits together is going to be the key component here as well.
All right, so a lot of efficiencies are being won. Can I bring you back in, Roy and Terence, if that's okay? You heard Nuala there mention the pandemic. I know a lot of the people who are in Ireland who would have motor neuron disease would engage with the Irish Motor Neurone Disease Association. Things have changed remarkably since COVID-19 appeared only 9 or 10 short months ago. Has that impacted on the kind of carer support or the kind of support in general, Roy, that people with motor neuron disease are experiencing at the moment?
Well, firstly, let me say, with regards COVID-19 and the lockdown, which is the biggest thing that's happened to everybody, they're locked into their houses, their apartments, and they're frustrated, depressed, angry, aggressive. I say to them, imagine your body being in lockdown and there's no minister coming in 2 or 3 weeks to unlock it. So really and truly, for me, COVID is a cup of tea. if you're careful and you do things right, you get through it. So I'm not that worried about it. It doesn't affect me that much.
And what about, I know we've talked about it before, about groups and peer support groups like the Irish Motor Neurone Disease Association. Has it impacted on their ability to sort of engage with patients or to be there for you in different ways?
Well, they are an incredible organization. Their CEO, Roisin Duffy, is amazing. I call the IMNDA my guardian angels. 4 incredible nurses. They provide very necessary equipment and great facilities. Without them, we'd be in a different place altogether. They're really incredible. The amazing thing is, last year, I was their ambassador for their biggest fundraiser, Drink Tea for MND, and we had a fantastic campaign. Wrote a jingle for them, very annoying, but it got through. People were singing it. We did a video for it, and we raised a lot of money. Due to COVID this year, we were not, or they were not rather, able to fundraise in the same manner, i.e., big functions, etc. So all had to be done online. So instead of having big tea rooms, we had big tea Zooms. And again, the IMNDA asked me would I come on board because they could not pick a new ambassador due to COVID. And I'm delighted to say it was a remarkable success. Really, I think Terence Morrison, their biggest fundraiser to date.
Fantastic.
So
that's wonderful. Orla, can I ask you something similar? How much more difficult has it been for someone like yourself to deliver, I suppose, healthcare to your neurology patients during this time? Because we do know that non-COVID related healthcare has suffered disproportionately in terms of the way the hospitals were structured, particularly in the first wave. Has it made things increasingly difficult for you to I suppose, engage or to treat people?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the overall picture of neurology, you're absolutely right. A lot of the outpatients were shut down, and it was difficult for people to access. So as clinical lead, I was involved in trying to do workarounds for that, and I think a lot of hospitals have pivoted to things like video link calls and remote calls and telemedicine. For motor neuron disease, actually, the story was a lot better because we anticipated quite early on that this would be an issue for people with motor neuron disease. And we approached the Department of Health, the HSE rather, with a business plan, which was a joint initiative between the National Clinic in Beaumont, the clinic in Cork and the clinic in Galway, and the IMNDA. And we put in a plan where we would bring everybody together as one big group, one big care group. The 4 IMNDA nurses, the 3 Beaumont nurses, one of ours was redeployed to ITU, so we had 2 specialist nurses. The research registrars that we had working with us, of whom there were 4, the consultants in Cork and Galway and the nurses in Cork and Galway. And we had a weekly meeting by telelink, by Zoom, and then we worked out who needed to be seen where and for how long and why. And we provided a high-level telelink, Zoom-linked calls for patients. Patients were seen where they needed to be seen. We did remote monitoring for their breathing. We did home visits, and then we audited that, and we didn't lose anybody. We 2 people with motor neuron disease got COVID, and one of them passed away sadly. But out of everybody, it was only 2 in the whole country got COVID. We did a lot of home visits. We did a lot of physician home visits. We massively reduced the number of people who needed to go to the emergency room by 84%. We helped people with their breathing at home. We initiated home breathing assessments, which Nuala mentioned. We had video linked training between our physiotherapists. We had video linked occupational therapy. We had video linked physiotherapy. And we provided, I think, the same level of care as we would had people be coming to the clinic. So even now, obviously we're back in something of a lockdown in Dublin now, but even during the time that the lockdowns were lifted a little bit, we still had about half of our clinics by video link and telemedicine. And as Nuala was pointing out, people love that. There are times when we need to see people, and we were able to provide a safe environment to review people. I don't think it's a good idea if somebody has just been diagnosed with motor neuron disease that's done by video link. And I think Roy and Terence and the description of their experience reflects that this has to be a face-to-face, sensitive, proper, not time limited set of conversations. But once we get over the period of coming to terms with acute diagnosis, I think it's possible to do a lot of work by video linkage. Can I come back to something that Nuala said a minute ago though about clinical trials and large trials? Because I think we need to go back to something that Russell said as well. If we think about our being a bit clever about how we select drugs and how industry select drugs, and then we can make the case for doing smaller, cleverer trials with small numbers of people if we think that the drug is going to be more likely to be effective. So large trials are based around the idea that you're expecting some of the drugs not to work at all in people, and we work out that there's going to be an error built into the trial. If we have precision medicine based studies, we can do much smaller trials. So for example, the C9orf trial that we're doing at the moment, we have one patient in that. There's only 74 in the whole world in that study, and the arm that we're doing is only 24 people in it. So if we had a drug that we thought was going to be effective, we can probably do smaller targeted studies in those people. And then what we have to do is work very hard on making sure that our outcome measures are sensitive and they're picking up the things that we want to measure in trials. So we have a lot of work to do as clinicians to make sure that happens, that we can deliver the right patients for the right drugs that Nuala is going to cohort in with the drug companies. So our objective is the right drug in the right patient at the right dose at the right time. And that's what TRICALS is about as well. And I think if we do that, we'll make Nuala's life a lot easier, because she won't be going around the world looking for 6 million patients. She'll be going around looking for the number of patients that is the right number to show that the right drug is working in the right patient. And I think if we do that, that's what precision medicine is about. And that'll make things a lot easier, because it means if we won't be wasting people's lives in a way, giving them a drug where there's no prospect really of the drug working, or because they don't have the right type of motor neuron disease.
Okay, so recruiting to the trial is very important as well.
Making sure that we have the right patients ready. And that's what our platform is about as well, this ICT platform, where if at a click of a button, when this is done, working with ADAPT and Trinity, because it's a big data science question as well. But the vision is that in 3 or 4 years' time, Nuala will come to me and I'll say, so you want this number of patients with these attributes. And I'll go on my computer, I'll click a button, and we will say, okay, there's 64 patients in Ireland, there's 45 in France, there's 63. And we can, on the click of another button, we'll say, okay, so would you like to enroll in this study? And it'll all be done electronically, and Nuala wouldn't have to go out looking for people at all. So that's what this platform is about. That's the great new vision, and it'll be around precision medicine, because we'll have all those patients really carefully characterized with research grade analysis, with all the things that we do already, all captured on this big platform. Press of a button, we'll be able to say, okay, how many patients do you want your trial? 300. Okay, here they are. That's what we'll do. You're on mute, Kira. You're on mute.
So I am, good Lord, I don't know, sorry, my apologies. And let me come back to you again, Roy, if that's okay. We mentioned your music earlier. You have represented Ireland with your band in the Eurovision, and you did lose to Celine Dion, but that was obviously a mistake. But now you're still using your music, and you're using your music for good as well. Tell us about the single that you are going to release, and about, I suppose, your own personal fundraising to help raise awareness for research in motor neuron disease.
Well, just over a year ago, Terence and I set up our own initiative called Watch Your Back MND. And we decided to approach our fundraising and awareness through music, because to the best of my knowledge, there's nobody else in the world with ALS, MND, gone around singing and telling people, listen, we're going to kick this thing in the backside. We want you to listen to us. We want to make awareness, and we want to raise money. So we decided to start writing a song. So from a musical point of view, we wrote a big swing number, got the best musicians in the country, top video, and we come up with a song called Watch Your Back MND. It got huge exposure and helped us enormously. We are now a year down the road. We decided we'd come out with a second single, but we'll approach it a little bit different, because I felt musically the first song was a very strong and with high musical content, but universally it might have slipped over a couple of people's head, because if you look at the video, maybe I look a bit too relaxed and a bit too comfortable. So we decided to be a bit more honest with this. Not that we weren't with the first one, but just to show people this is how it is. We want to tell our story from a musical point of view. So we've written a song called My New Dream, MND, My New Dream. And we think it's a really nice song. The production is great. The video production is excellent. And I think it is really going to make an impact. Never been done before. And I think,
Terence, a beautiful thing to be able to do with your dad. I'm sure it will be a big success, but also something very precious for the two of you to do together.
Yeah, absolutely, Kira. Yeah, we came up with the idea for My New Dream quite a while ago, you know, to have something with MND in it, but that, you know, it would make sense to everybody, because a lot of people unfortunately don't know what MND is, so we didn't want to have a song just called MND, so we came up with the title My New Dream. And, you know, the lyrics are straight to the point, the video is straight to the point, and it's something that we'll both cherish forever. You know, we haven't released it yet. It's going to be available to download on the 9th of October on all platforms. But we've shown a sneak peek of the video to a few people, and we've gotten great feedback. And we think, as my dad said, we try to be very honest with this, to get, I suppose, our point across that, you know, there is hope, but we are facing a big battle in our lives at the minute. But there is hopefully a brighter day happening tomorrow.
and that dream can come true.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course there's. We're coming to near the end of our talk this afternoon, but would any of you like to say anything else? Is there anything, you know, else that we haven't touched on today that you think it would be helpful for people to hear?
From my perspective, this is my positivity for the day. To hear the fight, the battle, the things that Russell is doing, Professor Hardiman's doing, Nuala is doing, it's all going the right direction. And that's what I like to hear. So thank you all for my positivity today.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you, Terence. Professor Hardiman, Dr. Murphy, Russell, I should be calling you all your various accolades, but would anyone else like to add anything, or will we leave the last word with Roy?
I think we should have the last word as two things. That one of the things is watch your back, MND, and the other one, Terence, is that MND is not, what's the phrase? MND is not an undertreated disease, it's an underfunded disease. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. It's not untreatable, it's just underfunded.
Not untreatable, it's just underfunded. Yeah.
Kira, maybe one last comment. I mean, and Orla, I probably met you 20 years ago on a trial, you know, that, you know, I guess didn't quite, you know, bring the solution to the table. But I think what really makes a difference in this particular area is people like you, Orla. You just pioneered the way. You're just so dedicated to research, and you're certainly highly reputed across the globe. You're the first port of call for any protocol that certainly comes into ICON. And I say that, you know, hand on heart. So, you know, I think it's fabulous what you've done in terms of TriCals. And, you know, we certainly would be delighted to partner with TriCals. You know, I reiterate, you know, we do need to get things done faster, quicker, and bring, you know, solutions to the table. You know, certainly notwithstanding, you know, these certain rare diseases where lifespan is, you know, a challenge. So, you know, I can only congratulate you on the research you've done, you know, thus far, and we'll certainly want to be a part of it.
Standing on the shoulders of giants like Roy and Terence. So I think that's the way we should see it. That's what we do. We stand on the shoulders of the giants.
Yeah.
Look, thank you all for speaking to me today. The ICON series, the Living With series with the Science Gallery, this has been running since 2019. It is an active partnership and ongoing between the Science Gallery and ICON. we are trying to explore healthcare, the human experience, the futures of disease, the treatment, the science, and all that behind it. And I hope you have enjoyed today. I would like to thank the panelists today, Dr. Nuala Murphy, and indeed I would like to thank Professor Russell McLaughlin. And I think it's fair to say the legend that is Professor Orla Hardiman, but indeed also the two legends that are Roy Taylor and Terence Taylor. For me, Dr. Ciara Kelly, thank you all for joining in. We will conduct a question and answer by text now. If anyone would like to send in any questions, we'll answer what we can, and we hope that today has been helpful and informative. Thank you all for taking part.